Welcome to the world of scale modeling with Mike Ashe, where techniques, tips, and creativity come alive with dozens of tutorials, projects, tape-up reviews, and picture references to help you build better scale models and enjoy our wonderful hobby. Hello everybody, and welcome to Part 1 of Building and Detailing the Hobby Boss 1 to 3/50th scale USS Alaska. The Alaska kit has excellent fit and exceptional surface detail. The parts count on this kit is over 1,300 pieces, so parts management is very important. I used 8 plastic bins for storing the parts as I worked on building and painting this model. This kit is also a complete kit. It has all the photoetch railings you need, and it has dozens and dozens of tiny photoetch parts. My Alaska build is basically out of the box, except some of the photoetch that was supplied with the kit wasn't usable, and so I replaced them with gold medal models photoetch parts. Also, the 20mm guns and the airplanes were not very well done, so they were replaced with parts from a Tamiya 1 to 3/50th scale Missouri. With all that said, let's get started on building and painting this kit. I do a tape-up of every kit I build, so all the main parts were removed from their trees, cleaned up, and taped together to check the fit. I also made detailed notes on the instruction sheets on issues I found. All the forward superstructure parts fit together very tightly. There were only minor areas where there were tiny voids. The aft superstructure fit together very well. However, the 40mm gun platforms needed some minor tweaking to get them to fit correctly against the larger aft superstructure assembly. The deck seam on the port side had a fairly tight fit, but it's small enough to where a bead of superglue will easily fill the void. The deck seam on the starboard side was even tighter than on the port side, and here again, a small bead of superglue will easily fill the void. I like to attach pedestals to my ship models first, so the entire assembly can be then mounted on a construction board. I measured the locations where the pedestals were going to go, and I drilled tiny holes through the hull. I then glued blocks of resin to the inside of the hull over those tiny holes I drilled so that the pedestals would have positive seating when I drilled larger holes. The threaded tops of the pedestals are 1/4 inch in diameter, so I used a 1/4 inch drill bit and drilled through the hull and the resin blocks. Once I'm done working on the hull, I'll go ahead and superglue those pedestals in place. This slide mold indentation on the bow, and there's one towards the stern, will be filled with superglue. There's some seam lines on the hull from the slide molding which will also have to be sanded smooth. The corners of the stern also have some slight indentations, and they're easy to fix. The openings for the anchor chain and the minesweep chain are already there, although there's a little bit of flash that needs to be removed. Tiny blocks of evergreen strip were used to fill the slight indentations in the stern, and they were attached with superglue. All the blemishes on the hull were wet sanded smooth with very fine sandpaper, and then the plastic was polished with very, very fine steel wool pads. I always check my work with silver paint, and if I find any remaining flaws, I reapply some superglue, sand it smooth, and then check with silver paint one more time to make sure the flaw's been removed. The plastic blocks on the stern have been sanded down, and the stern looks absolutely beautiful. I positioned the side keels with thin strips of masking tape. I then used a tiny bead of superglue on the inside area of the side keels and slowly worked my way down the side keel, adjusting the side keel as I glued it to the hull. I then removed the masking tape and applied a consistent bead of superglue all the way down the inside area of each keel and checked it with silver paint. The propeller shafts and the V-struts were positioned on the hull, and tiny beads of superglue were used to attach the V-struts to the shafts. The two-part rotor was also glued together, and now these subassemblies can be painted separately and then attached to the hull after the hull's been painted. I'll be gluing a reinforcing strip underneath the deck seam, but these 4 protrusions outlined in red will need to be flattened out first with some sandpaper. The instructions call for these 2 holes to be drilled out. These 4 sets of holes also need to be drilled out, and all my drilling was done with a .020 inch bit. The reinforcing strip was glued to the bottom of the deck, and I left a little bit of space so there wouldn't be interference with the hull. It's also very important to ensure that this strip sits flat against the underside of the deck. This kit has a lot of tiny parts for the main deck, so we'll start with the assembly of the rope reels. To replicate rope, I wrapped the drums of the rope reels with number 36 beading wire, which is .009 inches in diameter. I then superglued one side of the rope reel frame in place. The partially assembled rope reels were then positioned on the deck in their associated indentations. The other half of the rope reel frame was then positioned in place, and a tiny drop of superglue was applied. All the assembled rope reels are now ready for priming and painting. The forward deck section was positioned in place on the hull first. The longer aft deck section was then positioned in place, and both parts were secured to the hull with liberal amounts of masking tape. Tiny beads of superglue were applied along the seam line between the main deck and the side of the hull, using a thin wire applicator. After the superglue had dried, the tape was removed, and tiny beads of superglue were applied underneath where the tape was located. Use silver paint to check the deck seam between the main deck and the hull, and apply tiny beads of superglue where needed. Use the tip of a number 11 X-Acto blade held at about a 45-degree angle to carefully scrape the seams smooth. The main deck chocks are supposed to be glued flush with the outer side of the hull. However, this will interfere with the placement of the railings, so I marked their locations and then carefully scraped off the tiny raised positioning tabs. The deck seams had tiny drops of superglue added. The areas were then carefully scraped flat with a number 11 X-Acto blade and wet sanded with 600 grit sandpaper wrapped around a piece of balsa wood. A sewing needle and a length of photoetch brass were used to rescribe the wood deck detail at the seam locations. Only 2 light passes were necessary to restore that deck detail. Once the deck is primed and painted, you will have to use a magnifying glass to see where the deck detail was restored. The kit's plastic is a bit soft, so use light pressure when rescribing this deck detail. The brass pedestals were then glued to the hull, and silver paint was applied along the deck hull seam line one last time to check for any flaws. I plan on positioning the main deck railings right over the seam line between the main deck and the hull. Some of the molded-on splinter shields have some residual plastic that will need to be carefully scraped off with the tip of a number 11 X-Acto blade. The tops were then lightly wet sanded with a fine grit sanding stick. The outer edges of the deck chocks were positioned at the edge of the deck so that they will not interfere with the placement of the railings. For the anchor chain to sit correctly, the chain holes needed to be drilled out slightly larger and angled with a .039 inch drill bit so that the chain would sit flat. This also helps position the chain around the capstans correctly. As you test deck fittings, you will find that some of the positioning holes need to be slightly enlarged like the ones shown here. The holes for the vents at the stern also need to be slightly enlarged for a better fit. They were drilled out with a .025 inch drill bit. The deck winches need to be modified so that the windlasses sit correctly. Holes were drilled through the winch bases with a .036 inch drill bit to accept .035 inch plastic rod. The rod was glued in place with tiny drops of superglue and then trimmed. The windlass reels were carefully drilled out using a .025-inch drill bit and then a .037-inch drill bit. The winches were then assembled, and the positioning holes in the deck needed to be slightly enlarged in order to get them to fit correctly. I used tiny drops of Testor's tube glue applied with the tip of a toothpick to position small parts. After the glue dried, I applied tiny drops of super glue to strengthen the attachment. Several layers of superglue were applied to the seams on the back of the large vents. The catapult pedestals were glued from the inside first with superglue. Beads of superglue were then applied along the outside of the seam lines. The back sides of the vents and the sides of the catapult pedestals were run across wet stationary fine grit sandpaper to smooth out the superglue. The plastic was then polished with a fine steel wool pad. The inside areas of small assemblies were scraped flat so that tiny strips of plastic could be added to the inside to strengthen the seams. The kit's photoetch framing was too long for the forward 40mm platform, so the ends were cut off for a better fit. To better construct the deck vents, I made corresponding shapes with .04-inch thick plastic strips. This allowed me to wrap the tiny photoetch vent screens around these shapes. The photoetch tops were then glued to the shapes. Some of the photoetch screening was too long. Other sections of photoetch screening were slightly short. I trimmed the long ones and added tiny bits of plastic strip to make up for the tiny voids on the screens that were short. I used a tiny length of .05-inch plastic rod to wrap the small screen around this deck vent. The upper screen assemblies were attached to the lower plastic kit parts with Testor's tube glue, so that I had a little bit of time to position them correctly. Some of the hatch detail on the forward superstructure was missing, so I attached photoetch ones from a Gold Medal Models detail set. The tiny strip of plastic was set in place first for positioning of the hatch. The forward main superstructure assembly was glued using Testor's tube glue applied to the inside area of the second level. Stay tuned to our channel, where in Part 2 we continue our work on assembling more of the superstructure parts, as well as working on those delicate photoetch details. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a thumbs up. And when you get the chance, visit our website at www.mikeashley.com, where you're going to find dozens of free PDF downloads, including tutorials, picture references, model galleries, projects, and my 5 original scale modeling books. Thanks to Ben Sound and Videvo for the royalty-free music, and happy scale modeling!